Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Grant and Connor's Power Hour. This is volume number 9, and this is going to be a two-part series I do with Grant where we talk about the Quentin Tarantino movies because we've come up with a very original idea of two white dudes in their 20s talking about Quentin Tarantino for a couple hours. So Grant, I guess, do you want to introduce Reservoir Dogs a little bit? I guess let's just break this down film by film.
Yeah. Um, I guess I don't know how familiar you are with how it sort of came to be. Um, but in the early '90s, Mr. Quentin um, was a high school dropout, never attended any kind of post-secondary education, and I think he got like a equivalent, like a high school equivalent or something. But um, at some point in his 20s had found his found his way to the Sundance Institute that Robert Redford had put together, um, and had assembled this small screenplay, and basically worked on it at his time at the institute. Eventually, it gets in the hands of Harvey Keitel, who is really impressed with it, and helps secure funding. And in 1992, Quentin Tarantino finds himself back at Sundance, this time during the film festival, and uh, kind of kind of starts off what later kind of becomes like a really important decade for American independent cinema.
Right. I mean, you had a lot of people kind of start at this time. Wes Anderson, Quentin Tarantino, the Coens,
Steven Soderbergh,
Kevin Smith.
you know, Kevin Smith, a couple years down the line, but like Noah Baumbach, Whit Stillman around this
Right.
time. A lot of like serious, like well known and respected, American filmmakers
Right. A
who
lot of
got
people
a
who
huge
would
jump
who
up
are
in
kind of
this.
the household names of today. There aren't a lot of like house known directors. It's more of studio and franchise based movies now with
Yeah,
an anonymous man behind it, but a lot of the people that we actively talk about kind of started at this time with similar stories to Quentin because I know Quentin like was kind of a self-taught film nerd. He like worked in the video industry and all that
yeah.
flipping
I
movies.
know. This is technically not his first feature film. Uh, there's a now lost you know project that was called My Best Friend's Birthday, which um, I think at one point it was essentially just kind of some reused material for True Romance. It was what I believe. There's only about like 40 minutes or so that has
Right.
survived because like the only like copy that they had was pretty much completely destroyed
Did
in a
he do
warehouse
that on?
fire.
Do you know like what type of film he did that on? Was it like 16 or something, and then it burned
Uh,
down?
what it looks like is it's 16 based on like the. I mean, it could just be like a shitty transfer. Because I know it used to be on YouTube. I don't know if it still is, but I remember it like 10 years ago, um, watching what was available on YouTube, and it's. I mean, it's cheap. It is a. I think it was like completely financed by him, and
I'm
I think
sure.
it's where he met Lawrence Bender. Uh,
Kind of.
but
Yeah. No. I mean that definitely. I mean a lot of people have. Most filmmakers start with those kind of student films. It is kind of interesting, however, that um, he actually went feature for or almost feature length. I don't know how long it is with all the reels intact. But if it's 40 minutes, that's pretty long for like a student film. That's a fairly ambitious start.
Yeah, it was intended to be a feature. I think it was around 90 minutes. Is what it was. It's somewhere like 20 to 40 minutes is all that they were able to like save.
Right. I'll have to give that a watch. I'm actually kind of interested to see that. I always thought it was completely lost, so I didn't know
Yeah,
that
I
some
know
of
for a
it's still
while
out there.
it was available on YouTube. Uh,
If it was available on YouTube at some point, I'm sure I could track it down through nefarious means if needed, or hit up the Quentin Tarantino Reddit or something and get someone to send me a MP4 of it.
yeah. Um,
Interesting.
I mean, from what I remember, it is it is very much like kind of just a really rudimentary
So
example of what is kind of just known as a Quentin Tarantino production, and I think that that's something that is kind of cool about him. I have like a complicated relationship with him, as I think most people do.
right.
Um, you know, like post puberty young males do, I guess. Because when you're like 15, he's like the only one of the only filmmakers that you know based on
Right. I
like
mean, I ran a
personally.
movie theater for a couple years, with most of my employees being 16-year-old boys. So I definitely not only remember a time where Quentin Tarantino was probably my most influential filmmaker on me, but I also talked firsthand with a lot of kids who say, well, Inglourious Bastards has to be the best movie of all time. Slow your roll there a bit, buddy, but I do agree. Inglourious Bastards
Yeah,
is a good movie.
well, you got to start.
We'll
You
get
got to
back.
start somewhere.
We'll get back to that. No, he is a good gateway because he works for a mainstream audience, but he definitely, especially, and one thing I appreciate about Quentin Tarantino before we dive into the movie specifically is that he's kind of a champion for obscure cinema. Granted, a lot of his basis is 70s and 80s grindhouse type cinema that he grew up on, but
Yeah,
it's still he talks about things outside of the mainstream, and he's willing to kind of uh hopefully get his fan base to branch out beyond the Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, Eli Roth kind of sphere that he's
yeah.
built himself. Because much like Kevin Smith, he kind of aligns himself with people. I only bring up Kevin Smith because he comes up all the time on this podcast, but also in our last episode when we did our episode on
Toxic Avenger.
Toxic Avenger, an interesting choice. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's interesting. And I've been listening to his podcast he does with Roger Avery lately. Have you listened to that at all?
No, I saw he was doing because I know him and Avery had a bit of a falling out after Pulp Fiction.
Oh, I
I don't
didn't
know
even
how.
know that. I just knew they had a podcast
Yeah,
together. But it makes
yeah. So
sense
it
because their
seemed
professional
over time.
relationship has had decayed.
Yeah, it seems like they've kind of come back together after years because I know Avery start was at whatever fucking video store that Mr. Tarantino was at. I know that's kind of how they met. So
Yeah.
it's nice, I mean, call me a sap, but I think it's nice when people can have like a healthy reunion.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely
But
yeah, no,
I
it's
haven't listened to a single episode just because time I have to listen to Quentin Tarantino talk. It's like nails on a chalkboard.
yeah. It's
Um,
actually a pretty tolerable podcast. He doesn't you go on too many tangents. They kind of set up a movie, and then I think they do like 2 to 3 movies a week, and then they kind of just talk out these movies. It's kind of a point by point, you know. The film criticism, I would say, is slightly deeper than the nostalgia critic, but it's the same thing where they're like, and then in this scene, Clint Eastwood flies a jet plane, and then in the next scene, Clint Eastwood
Badass.
rides a horse. And it's like, okay, it's a bit point by point, I'd say. It's not the deepest film criticism, but I mean, that it would be hypocritical for me to consider them, to shit on them for that when I am the master of puddle deep film criticism. But it's still good. It's a good podcast. It's actually kind of fun. I listened to the episode where Eli Roth was on. That was kind of fun. And it kind of makes me nostalgic for the video store era because they talk a lot about their video store days. So it's fun. But regardless, I guess Quentin Tarantino's last kind of venture, other than films and podcasting, has been novels and stuff. I haven't read any of his novels. Have you read either of those? Because I think he's made 2 books now. One that's like
It was a novelization of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I haven't read. And then October of last year, he put out a book about film criticism and like a almost scholarly kind of expedition called Cinema Speculation, which I have mixed feelings about because I don't know, his brand of like film criticism and like journalism is just something that doesn't sit right with me. I have a very complicated relationship with him where like I really love his turns out I really love his movie. I don't know if I would necessarily call him my favorite filmmakers, but he is someone that I do admire and like respect on a filmmaking aspect. When I have to listen to him talk about movies, it is less ideal, just
Right.
because his brand is not really kind of my like up my alley. But I do think it's very funny that his book is filled with like tons of spelling and grammar errors. That just
I'd expect none less from
made
the high school dropout himself. I'm just kidding.
yeah,
But
you know,
still, no, I mean,
point maybe that's like part of the maybe it's on brand for him. I don't want to sound like I'm a hater. Like I don't hate him. I think overall, like my feelings are positive. He's like I don't know. He's almost like a good friend that just constantly pisses you off, or like
right.
am I making sense?
No, I get what you're saying. Um, yeah, I guess those were just a couple aspects I wanted to touch on before, I guess diving into the meat of these 2 episodes, which is going to be the films. We went into a little bit of background on Reservoir Dogs so far, mostly just the film beforehand that never got made. But didn't he do kind of like a work cut of Reservoir Dogs?
Yeah, he did a proof of concept short film essentially with I want to say Buscemi at that point was cast as Mr. Pink and I think Harvey Keitel. Um, don't quote me though.
Sure. I've never seen the proof of concept. I don't know if that's something that's out, but I think that's kind of an interesting background that he did end up making a proof of concept to an extent. You have some of that. I don't know how uncommon that actually was back in the day, because you look at something like Wes Anderson's Bottle Rocket, which is a similar situation, where there's a bottle rocket
Yeah, kind
short
of like a proof
film.
of concept. Yeah. I know that that's just kind of a way to secure funding that people have. It's like a, like
No, it makes
a,
sense.
Damien Chazelle, I know, used that to secure financing for Whiplash. Look at him now. So I mean, it's not like a revolutionary, concept, um, but it is used very effectively, I think.
But I think that like probably the 90s seemed like an era where something like that started to become more normalized because we don't see a lot of like I mean, I guess the studio system really changes in the 80s and 90s during the VHS era. Um, so I wonder if that's why something like that became more common because we don't have like a kind of like a proof of concept for like Citizen Kane or something else like Casablanca per se.
Sure. Yeah, I think. Yeah, it's definitely kind of at that time really taking advantage of huge huge step forward in the medium, um, and it's nice to know that that still seems like a viable option for people, um, which is cool. And I think a lot of it is owed to
Right.
that crowd that really took advantage of it.
Well, I think the
So,
90s too, it definitely isn't as film isn't as accessible as today, but it's definitely the point where film becomes accessible to people, beyond
for
like
sure.
Super 8 films, kind of like you could make a Super 8 film starting in like the 50s and 60s. I know some people made it through with cheap little camera setups earlier, but the 90s is where you could get enough equipment that if you could get a couple people together, some guys and gals to work with you, you could actually make a somewhat watchable proof of concept or film. Where I don't know how viable that option was before the 80s and 90s with the advent of like shooting on tape. And we even have some examples of films fully shot on tape, like Roller Gator. I don't know why Roller Gator is the first thing that came to mind, but that's a film that was shot on tape,
Yeah,
which I think is interesting. And um, I think opened the door for a lot more people because I mean, most filmmakers these days kind of get an entry based on the same kind of blueprint that people like Tarantino went off of, where it's like, I'm going to make my proof of concept. I'm a social enough person. I can get some people together. I can make a coherent script and a coherent narrative, kind of doing it garage band style. And then obviously going on to be a 100 million plus filmmaker. So it's interesting. Uh, but I guess for people who haven't seen Reservoir Dogs, um, do you want to give just a couple sentences describing what the movie's about, just so that people have an idea?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's probably the most. Um, I think it's the most accessible um, Quentin Tarantino film. I don't think it was the first Quentin Tarantino flick I saw. I think that was Pulp Fiction, but I think this is more accessible for a couple of reasons. One, it's like the most self-contained. It's the most straightforward,
Sure.
and two is it is kind of like impressive to me because it is like it, I guess sort of like the perfect setup for his career, because a lot of aspects that eventually became like staples of his really kind of start showing here in his first film, and I think that that's really impressive as a first time, albeit not truly first time, but first time filmmaker, creating their quote unquote debut feature, to be this confident and this like self actualized, you know, fully helmed, feature film. I think it's pretty impressive. Um,
Well, and also to do it with an original IP, because you look at someone like Fincher and he kind of started with stuff like Aliens, Alien 3, or was that Alien 4? No, it was Alien
yeah,
3.
it was definitely yeah.
I think Fincher's a pretty comparable director to Tarantino, which is
Yeah,
why I bring it up.
maybe the number two, film bro director, second only to Quentin Tarantino.
Mr. Tarantino himself. Yeah.
Yes, I think David Fincher is a better filmmaker. I'm a little biased though because I am 100% a Fincher fanboy.
I think I think Tarantino is more, and you might disagree with me, but I think Tarantino is more consistently good. But Fincher's highs, like Zodiac and stuff, are just so much more engrossing and intriguing. Or
Yes.
Fight Club, or Seven. There's, I kind of named a few of the basic ones, the basic Fincher. I didn't dig deep for my examples, but I think Fincher at his best is far more intriguing than Tarantino, who Tarantino can make a consistently fun movie, and I don't think he's going to make a movie I dislike per se, but he's not going to it's rare for Tarantino to hit the heights of, well, this is just an almost untouchable classic where, like, I think Fincher can make a really smart movie. Like Zodiac is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, I think Fincher has a little bit, more to say, with his work,
For sure.
but I don't mean to like downgrade, the work of Tarantino.
Yeah,
Um,
I would love to do a Fincher and a Wes Anderson episode because I feel like we could talk a lot about both of those filmmakers as well as Tarantino.
hey, now you're talking my language right there.
Yeah.
I think I have quite a bit to say about both. So,
Plus, we just got to pick filmmakers that'll get views, and then eventually we'll pull it. We'll go for the deep cuts eventually, An
yeah.
Andy Sidaris episode would be great. Have you seen any Andy Sidaris films?
Is that the fucking what is that? That like troll movie or what was the?
He did like Hard Ticket to Hawaii, Savage Beach. He got a
I think I'm
muse, Donna Hamilton, and she's just this like aging Playboy model. She's not old, but she's aged out of Playboy. She's maybe in her like early 30s at the start, and almost and
Mhm.
touching 40, touching some older territory by the end. But he's just having her flash her breasts around and shoot bazookas and drive around. I can say Andy Sidaris is for sure an auteur. I think that'd be a funny ass episode. I have all those movies on Amazon because they're like $5 each, and they're a fucking hoot, man. They're a fucking hoot. I love Andy Sidaris. I used to watch. I bought all of his movies and watched them all at when I was working at AMC because I would do paperwork at the end of the night and just throw on a Sidaris. My God, I've watched like 20 Sidaris movies, and he could have made 100 and it never would have got old. His style's the same, and you would think it's so basic, but he knows so much how to make a fun action movie, which I think is similar to Tarantino. Obviously, Tarantino's a lot less exploitation. And also, I feel like Tarantino, I guess, even starting with Reservoir Dogs, with like
Would you say that would you say that Andy Sidaris is a more of an exploitation filmmaker?
yeah, for
Because to
sure.
me, I wouldn't say I think Quentin Tarantino is influenced by exploitation. That's very apparent. I would not consider him an exploitation filmmaker. Um,
No, he takes a
I don't even think
level of
he.
it. Um, I mean, in a way, like certain movies, like we're gonna go on to Django Unchained and stuff later, but you look at like Django Unchained, and it kind of follows the black exploitation style, where you have a black cast, a white director. It ultimately leads to kind of
Well, he,
this victory for a black person and their kind of clan, but it's kind of put through a revenge label, which in a lot of ways describes a lot of 70s black exploitations. And I think exploitation as a genre, I mean, exploitation movies, I couldn't. The biggest criteria I think that takes Quentin Tarantino out of the running for an exploitation film is the fact that a lot of his films cost $150 million.
yeah, yeah,
Where exploitation films, a primary aspect of it is that they are cheap films that are using blank concepts. You got like all sorts of exploitation subgenres: black exploitation, women in cages, monster movies. All of these things have inspired crime movies too. All of these things inspire Quentin Tarantino. So I would almost consider him a weird subgenre, or maybe not even subgenre. If he's exploitation, it's a weird. It's like a mainstream exploitation, if that makes sense. Like it is. It's something interesting to ponder because he fits 90% of the criteria, but there's 10% that he misses, and that 10% is so integral to the exploitation genre that I don't know if I would necessarily consider him an exploitation filmmaker. I think that would be slightly off base.
yeah. I think I think he's just someone who really enjoys wearing his influence on his sleeve.
Right. You listen to him talk, and he loves these like 70s and 80s movies, and you can tell that ties in. And each
Yeah,
movie has very strong theming. And I think almost, is it unfair, especially, you know, maybe less so in his early era, but definitely now his characters almost have like a cartoony aspect where I think you can, it's really easy to read his characters. They're
yeah.
almost
And
they're slightly two dimensional.
I have a theory, but which we can get to for sure, um, because it's definitely there. And I'm glad that you said that. I'm glad that you used cartoony because I do have means of getting there eventually.
Yeah, no.
So Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, so Reservoir Dogs. Um yeah,
Yeah, I think it's kind of the perfect start to a career because I mean he's got all of his staples there is very lively casts with very distinct performances and personalities. I mean the opening scene alone it gives you a perfect um, it's just like this perfect sense of every character's personality and
yeah,
it sets up so much stuff surrounding that. Even the conversation of the Madonna track, um, and leading into the conversation about tipping
right.
is one of my favorite things he's ever written.
Well, the
Um,
other thing I like about Reservoir Dog, or just Quentin Tarantino in general, is his kind of fun back and forth dialogue. I don't know how much we're going to talk about movies he's written, but I feel like you can definitely tell a film that's written by Quentin Tarantino, and kind of the thesis statement to that, and I guess even how he shoots a movie is Reservoir Dogs.
sure, yeah, absolutely. Um, Speaking of just how he shoots it, um, I do think it's very interesting that you know, as much as they said, like it's very very much his film. Um, it's also very apparent that it is his first film because there's not a lot of confidence in where to put the camera. I think it's a little bit more varied than someone like Kevin Smith who never moves the camera. He just
Yeah.
sits it down on wide. But there is a lot of wide shots in this movie. There's not a ton of movement until specifically the Mr. Blonde uh, stuck in the middle with you
Yeah.
scene handheld that really feels like the movie is kind of starting to come into its own.
No, it's interesting you say that because that's like a scene where um you almost see the butterfly come out of the cocoon a little bit. Um
Yeah,
that type of style now seems like commonplace for Tarantino, but when you look at Reservoir Dogs specifically, um Quentin
you
Tarantino
can tell.
bleeds confidence in most of his movies, and I don't know how much he had that during Reservoir Dogs for most of it, but in that stuck in the middle with you sequence, you definitely feel it kind of start to come together, um, and him kind of open up as a filmmaker and give it his all. I'm not saying that Reservoir Dogs isn't a solid film, but it definitely has aspects of first film, kind of first filmitis, I guess. I definitely
For sure,
agree with
you
you
can
on that.
tell that there is a desire to prove something. He's just not quite sure of himself, and I think um, this really is important to him in the idea of like, okay, I can do this because going into Pulp Fiction, it is like night and day. They do feel like two movies that one they both feel like movies that a director could have made, in the middle of their career, but they also feel almost like a decade apart in their approach and structure,
No, I agree.
which I think is really cool
Reservoir Dogs feels delightfully amateurish to where I'd almost say it
in kind of a
it makes a
charming way.
lot of sense that it's the first film of extremely big talent who would go on to do bigger and better things. I think going back to Wes Anderson, and I've compared him a lot to his contemporaries. I don't know why Wes Anderson's on my mind so specifically. I wish I had different examples, but you look at like Bottle Rocket, and you start to see the style to an extent, but you also see someone who's not going to try to like when you start a new job and you're a little bit tensed up the first couple days or first couple weeks, and then you start to
Yeah,
get into the flow of things.
you got
That
to get used to it.
Yeah, you get used to it. You start opening up more, figuring out um, kind of how it works. And I feel
Mhm.
like you have that
Some
with both Bottle Rocket and Reservoir Dogs. I think they're surprisingly comparable films.
Yeah, yeah. I think they're both great starts with
But
and do eventually lead into a better second feature.
right, but
Yeah.
I guess I
A
think
better, a more realized second feature where
right,
they're more calm.
and I think also you just have a level of you have a level of trying to stick with the pack a little more before they kind of spread their wings, for better or for worse, because I think both Quentin Tarantino and Wes Anderson have tended to have their heads up their asses occasionally for features. Um, I like most Quentin Tarantino and Wes Anderson films, but you can tell moments where it's like, yep, that's a Quentin Tarantino moment. Um, but this film lacks a lot of the auteurist touch of Tarantino, and perhaps some of the flavor. But you do see sprinkles of it, like of course the dialogue. I think this kind of long, personable middle class dialogue even lower class dialogue, I suppose, was kind of popular with filmmakers of the time, like Kevin Smith and Tarantino and stuff. We start to see more long-winded characters, less exposition, more hanging out, shooting the shit. And I think that's something that really defines 90s filmmaking, and I think that's pretty prevalent in Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask you, maybe to cap off the Reservoir Dogs discussion, but I'm curious about specifically this one thing that I noticed upon like rewatching, and it's the almost aside from the waitress character, who I'm not sure has a single line of dialogue, is really just like an extra. There's not a single female character, and it's his only movie that doesn't have a prominent female presence. Um, but there is this really tender connection between Mr. White and Mr. Orange, and I'm curious, like, you know, your thought on that, because I know he's talked about it before, where he's seen that as like a fatherhood kind of relationship, father and son, and I think it's very apparent there. Aside from the fact that he literally spelled it out and discussed it, but
Yeah.
I'm curious about it, your like thought. I don't know if you've seen or heard his discussion on that, but I'm curious about.
No, I haven't specifically, but you definitely do get that sense watching the film. Kind of to your first point too, that is kind of interesting. I never put two and two together on that, but this is a very male centric film. I almost wonder if
I mean, he has a very masculine kind of energy to his work as a filmmaker, but I don't.
but
I
he's
have
definitely interested
feelings.
in females. And one thing I will give him credit for is kind of making, and I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, he does have strong female characters, but he does like looking through the lens of women as people more than some filmmakers who just say who treat women like these invincible objects, or because they want to push women power so hard, or on the flip side, women as weak and defenseless, where I think Quentin Tarantino at times wants to show them as vulnerable and at times wants to show them as hardened badasses. I'm wondering what that switch was, because you almost watch Reservoir Dogs as a very male centric film. Like,
I have
I
a
mean,
theory.
even the primary cast, you look at the main cast and it's all of these male characters in a line. Like, it's definitively a very masculine movie, even kind of the
Yeah,
idea of it and a lot of the characterizations. So I'm surprised I never made that connection, because that is surprisingly prevalent, especially when you think of even his newest film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, has Sharon Tate as the lead, a female. You got Kill Bill, a
yeah,
duology of films which stars a strong female. Jackie Brown is in the title. Pulp Fiction. You got right on the cover. I mean, other than his westerns, which fall a little more male centric, a lot of his films were female heavy. So I wonder what the change was. Yeah, I would have been
yeah,
interesting. You know, you can psychoanalyze it without much context to the man. You know, obviously we don't have a
yeah.
lot of interviews from Quentin pre-fame, but
I definitely have a theory, um,
yeah, what's
which I
that?
think we can more. I think we can elaborate on it more once we get to Kill Bill, because there's definitely some stuff that I want to bring up along the way. To maybe so it makes more sense, if that makes sense.
Right. No, for sure. Those are both interesting points. Um, I'm trying to think of what else I really have to say on Reservoir Dogs. I think it's a very good
I think
freshman
I can say
film.
we both really like it.
I
Um,
really do like it. I admit I haven't seen it in a while. I did buy the 4K, which I'm interested to see the master on that. I have
I
the
would say I do genuinely like love it. Um, it's like, I mean, if you're gonna give number ratings any validity, I mean, this is like a 9 out of 10 for me. I enjoy it very much. I can revisit it pretty much anytime. Someone could put this on at any time, and I'd be like, oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, let's check this out. Because I do find it a very rewarding film to watch because there is always something that I come back to appreciate more and more,
right.
which I think is something great about any movie.
I think I'm flying similar. It has flaws. But it really is. It's a very strong first entry, and and I almost would have loved to have seen this because by the time I saw this movie, my first Tarantino film I believe was Django Unchained because Aiden was kind of talking about Tarantino.
Yeah, I
When Django
know the
Unchained came
first.
out, I was 13 years
I
old
know
or
the first
14.
movie of his we would have been made aware of was Inglorious Bastards.
Right. You already saw
Because I remember
Inglorious Bastards. I didn't see Inglorious Bastards. I think Death Proof was the last Tarantino movie I watched, but Inglorious Bastards was the second to last. But you had seen it and you were kind of raving about Inglorious Bastards, and Aiden was talking about it. So I wanted to see what the hubbub was about, and I watched Django Unchained, and then shortly thereafter, I watched Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction.
yeah, I
Um,
think that's where things really kicked in for both of us of being made aware of 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 him and his body of work. Because yeah, we would have been like 14, 15 at the time. That was what 2012.
yeah, and
Yeah,
well, I can shit all over kids. Well, I look at kids who have a Pulp Fiction poster on their wall, and think cringe at the concept of people thinking Tarantino's their favorite filmmaker. It's hard to not transfer myself to their age, 14 to 16, and think
oh yeah,
at least Tarantino was in my top five back then. I
oh
think
for
I've
sure.
definitely gotten into deeper filmmaking than Tarantino typically dips in. And I can also understand the allure of Tarantino. Obviously, we'll talk a lot about Tarantino throughout this discussion, and on the wrap up, I'm sure. But kind of the allure of Tarantino. Um, it's interesting, and I think Reservoir Dogs, like I think we both agree that it's a fantastic start. I think we should get into Pulp Fiction, um, just because
Yeah,
I think Pulp Fiction is where Tarantino started to. I think this is his proving ground. He made a good movie with Reservoir Dogs, but it's almost something anybody could have made. It could have been a Paul Schrader. It could a lot of even like the wave before them, like the new Hollywood kids, could have made a
sure.
Reservoir Dogs potentially. But
Yeah, I mean,
Pulp
I think
Fiction
it's gotten the
solidified his
experience.
style.
Yeah, I think it is like it's definitely the movie he would have made after having a hit because there's this sense of confidence to it, like uh, the use of the camera in terms of framing and even just like camera movement is so much more controlled and methodically paced. There's a lot more of there's a lot more variety in shots where it's not just close-ups and wides. I mean, it is there's different parts of the body that are accentuated with different
Right.
shots and different characters that really give you this sense. He's not only just using the script, to give you a feel of the characters, like with Reservoir Dogs. But he's also utilizing the camera. I mean, not to jump around, but Mia Wallace's introduction is the first thing we see of her is her mouth, um, which is kind of this use of like her sex appeal. You
Right.
could have someone do from the leg up, you know, to the face, but he uses so much time to get a feel that really kind of like really makes the reveal of her rewarding. And I know, I'm gonna try to not bring up his obsession with feet because it's so tired and played out, and I think it's just a really lame thing to bring up at this point. But the it's obvious that he has a foot fetish, and I think for a guy who has a lot of movies that don't have that have a lot of like strongly written female characters, I think it's very cool that a lot of his movies do not have this kind of like predatory gaze of women,
Right.
or like the traditional sense. But there is something very telling that the next shot we see of Mia is of her feet, and I think that also has something to do with his attraction. But
Yeah,
uh,
I'm trying to come up with something that I'm trying to come up with words to describe it because a lot of the times it almost doesn't feel predatory. Occasionally it does
not in the
though.
traditional sense.
Like it's different because I mean we were talking about Andy Sedaris earlier, so Andy Sedaris is my example. Andy Sedaris loves breasts. He fucking has Donna Hamilton's breasts, and every other girl in his movie exposed themselves 20 times. And that's the scene, you know? Donna Hamilton says, I need to think really hard about this. Let's go into the hot tub. And then her and four of her friends whip their breasts out and sit in a fucking hot tub. And then the scene is over after we get an uncomfortably long view of them. And in a way, I almost think, not to really defend Tarantino putting his fetish to screen, but a lot of the time he either tries to warrant it or he finds a way to fit it in. I just don't understand.
Yeah,
It's still a little strange. I'll put it that way, but I I,
it's
I don't think
I
it's
think
really worth
it's
dwelling on, and I think he's less exploitative than some people with it. Um,
he's clearly not the first filmmaker to put his fetish into his work. Um,
yeah, I mean, you look at women in prison films. It takes a fetishist to a fetish movie. Basically, it may as well be a softcore porn.
I just wanted to get it out there because I think hopefully that is the last time I'm going to talk about his relationship with feet, because
Yeah,
I don't think a lot of it really warrants the discussion. I mean, if we want to talk about him personally, that is a whole other thing because I do find part of it to be a little unprofessional. But on the other end, we're looking at him. The way I saw this and the way we've talked about it before recording was to kind of look at his evolution as a filmmaker.
yeah. I'm not gonna call him a genius for putting feet in film. But at least a lot of the times there is something that is an attempt to um, rationalize it, perhaps. For example, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, when Brad Pitt's giving the hitchhiker the ride back to the Manson family, he shows that lady's feet. She puts her feet up on the dashboard, and I see it as the lady's relaxed, almost kind of drugged out. It adds to her character, but it's still exploitative. It just might be a little different than Andy Sedaris throwing Donna Hamilton in a hot tub with her
Yeah,
breasts out. But at the same time, it's the same idea.
I think
Um,
it's a little bit different with him because he also writes females as like actual characters.
Right, which almost adds a level of creepiness to it, you know? I don't know. It is kind of interesting to
To me,
ponder the psychology of it, even though we're not necessarily I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I almost want to rip the band-aid off
yeah,
because I think there's
I don't
something
think
psychologically
there's
there and trying to
yeah,
uncover
I
it.
don't think that there's a ton to say about it. I think
No.
it is just a little interesting. And I also would just really like to everyone put that fucking joke to rest.
Right. It's the
Because,
easy jab at Tarantino for sure.
yeah, it's old.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
but I
fine.
mean, to
Uh
talk about
Going back to Pulp Fiction, I think we've had enough of this. I don't think we'll.
yeah,
Let's take the vow now to never mention feet again in this video unless there's a very valid reason.
I'll,
If we
I'll
come up
agree.
with the most profound reason to mention it that doesn't include a cheap jab at Quentin Tarantino, then it's allowed. But otherwise,
Yeah,
from here on out, it's outlawed. That was our
yeah. It's one of the least interesting things about him because it's just clearly a fetish, and that's it. Like,
right.
I don't have much else to say about it. I have quite a bit to say about Pulp Fiction because I even though there's a lot of new stuff to be said about it, I do think, um, I think I don't know how you feel about it personally. I love this movie. I
I
have
love it
always
as
loved it.
well.
It is I would say it's
My confession
um,
is I've only seen Pulp Fiction like twice.
oh, I watch it pretty frequently. I watch it almost like once a year because I love it. I think it's a great watch. I think for a movie that's 2.5 hours long, it is beautifully paced. And I think it is really like a huge step up from Reservoir Dogs, a movie I already love. I think this is like yeah, like when people say that this is one of the best films of the '90s, I think that that's warranted. I don't know if it's my favorite film of the '90s. I don't think I would say that. It's definitely up there because I do really love it. Like most people,
It's something in the
it's
90s that I think is worth talking about. I
yeah,
also think it is the most I think Reservoir Dogs was a sketch of Quentin Tarantino's career, and this is the mold. I don't necessarily think Quentin Tarantino as a filmmaker fits a mold, but if we look at a lot of the archetypes and kind of
it has
the
a lot of
tourist
conventions.
themes and conventions we're looking at later on in Tarantino's career, the interesting thing about Pulp Fiction is that's kind of where a lot of it starts.
Hmm. I think it is. Like I said, I think it's the work of a much more confident filmmaker. I mean, even down to the length of shots, they're much longer um, than Reservoir Dogs, and like I said, like he's willing to put the camera into unconventional spaces to really give you a feel of the environment and the character,
Right.
and much more subjective filmmaking. Um, it's much more colorful too. He really uses the different environments to his advantage,
Yeah.
which
I also
is something that I do think
love
is sorely missing.
I love the feel of this.
It's a
Uh
very warm movie.
this is gonna I don't know if you've seen this film. So this might be a weird analogy, but it almost feels like Robert Soydmax, The Killers for the 1990s. You got boxing and crime. Have you seen The Killers before?
It's the Hemingway short story, right?
I
Am I thinking?
think it was because it was also adapted to a TV movie in '64 by Don Siegel. But the '40s version it's an amazing movie, and it
Yes.
has very
Um,
similar themes to Pulp Fiction.
I haven't seen the movie, but I've read the short story.
If you want to see Pulp Fiction made in 1946, watch The Killers from 1946.
Oh,
It's so interesting because I was watching that movie and I'm like, this is great, but it almost feels derivative. And then I was like, no, this isn't derivative. I think this inspired Pulp Fiction in a couple ways. Or if it didn't, just the osmosis, it inspired something that inspired something that inspired something that inspired Pulp Fiction. But I just think that's interesting because I'm just such a fan of like golden age Hollywood and like early sound films and stuff that and I know you are too. So that
yeah, I
actually
mean, yeah,
might
we follow
interest
each other
you.
on Letter.
I would add that to the watch list, add that to the pile,
Mhm.
because it's like an hour. I think it's like an hour and a half, but it has a lot of similar themes to Pulp Fiction. So I recommend it. It was kind of
Speaking
yeah.
of, I was going to say, speaking of themes for Pulp Fiction, I don't know if this is your take, but to me, this is one of the more like philosophical movies that I think than people like to give it credit for.
Yeah.
I think it's his most philosophical film. Um,
Well, we'll get to
I
this
mean,
later in this podcast, but I think Kill Bill is where um a lot of where the thinking man's Tarantino kind of ends. I'm not saying that there isn't smart filmmaking to it, but I think post Jackie Brown there's less like themes and more an idea.
I don't know if I would totally agree, but I think we can get to.
We'll get to
I
it.
think yeah.
Well, I just think like especially if you look at it from like a philosophy standpoint, his first three films felt the smartest to me. I think there's a level of dissidence or a level of I think Tarantino leans more heavily on his exploitation influences past Pulp Fiction. But I do agree that I think like this is kind of the thinking man's oh my god. This is the thinking man's Tarantino film. It's a smart film and it takes a lot more aspects because when I watch it like I would hate to say this, but I feel like a lot of Tarantino films I could pass like Jackie Brown. I feel like I could whip out my cell phone or sit in my room and jack off for a half hour, come back, and then I still know Django's on the revenge quest, you know? uh, I'm being a little dramatic here, perhaps, but I definitely feel like something like Pulp Fiction's more of a tangled web, is what I'm trying to say.
To me, it's very much like Quentin Tarantino's like whole philosophy on like the world and like existence with this movie. Because to me, standing out on my last rewatch, um, it seems like it's very much just about like this like cruel, uncaring, like random nature of the universe and
Right.
how kind of like nothing is owed to you. Not in like a depressing, like dark way. I mean, there is kind of a darkness to Pulp Fiction. I don't think I'm the first one to make any of these observations, but it really stood out to me this time that it is kind of this not nihilistic approach, but it is very much like the world is unfair, and so there's kind of this idea of essentially kind of giving value to your life.
Right.
I think it's really wrapped up with Jules and Vince's conversation at the diner after the whole situation with Marvin getting his head blown off on accident after they had just survived this
Right.
after they just witnessed what Jules is convinced is a divine intervention, and Vince just kind of shoves it off and whatever, and he's like, you're full of shit, you're crazy, all this stuff, but Jules having this newfound appreciation for life because he commits no violence after that.
Right.
After realizing he's witnessed a divine intervention, um, and Vince kind of shrugging it off and kind of having almost this nihilistic approach, and eventually later on, I mean earlier in the film, but later on chronologically, ends up being killed in this embarrassing fashion of just being caught with his pants down,
Right.
metaphorically and literally, coming out of the bathroom.
I always thought that's one of the scenes that's really stuck with me. And I'm really interested to rewatch this film. It has been about a year for me, admittedly. But that is a scene that definitely stuck out to me. And just kind of the whole idea of, I don't know. I definitely agree with what you're saying. Like, kind of it's almost like a series of unfortunate circumstances for these people who.
Yeah, but not in like a punishing way.
Not
You
in
know
a
what I mean?
punishing
Like,
way. It's a life is unfair kind of way, and it's
yeah,
like
but it's not
shit
like this
happens.
morose. Yeah, it's not kind of like this pessimistic way about it. Like to me, it very much is just like this idea of like life is random and it can be really awful at times. But that's kind of the idea of like taking value in it. You only get one life.
Right.
Um, if that makes if I don't sound like like I'm rambling too much or like like some freshman philosophy student.
Hey, that's okay. This episode is dedicated to us, to you freshmen, philosophy students. So I think it's perfectly fine. I think we just wrote somebody's paper. I think they're gonna cheat off of our shit. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's definitely an interesting take on Pulp Fiction, and you can see the progression. I still think, dare I say, this film it's like Reservoir Dogs with a lot of confidence. And what I mean by this is that you definitely see the step up in confidence, but it definitely feels like an early hungry filmmaker still. Do you think that's unfair to say? Like, I don't think
really,
Quentin
you think so?
Tarantino could push out another Pulp Fiction if he tried his hardest right now. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's kind of
In terms
like,
of like the energy,
yeah, in terms of the energy, but also
it has the
just.
energy of a young man making a film, but I think
I think Quentin
just
Tarantino still keeps that energy to an extent. It
yes,
just
I think
also feels like an early film that, yeah, I don't even really know what I'm trying to describe, but
I think
it
from a
still feels very
directorial
early.
standpoint, yeah. I
It
think from a directorial standpoint, I think Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs feel like they were made like 10 years apart, as opposed to two. Um,
Yeah, to an
it
extent.
is a much more confident film.
And I think also there's films that define the 90s and the 90s wave of filmmakers. Everybody kind of made their amateur piece that got them famous, and then you have everybody from that wave kind of making their mark on things. And I think this is Tarantino making his mark and kind of hitting that rookie home run, like as a baseball analogy. He's kind of the rookie who hits a home run with this. He proved himself as part of the team with Reservoir Dogs, but this is where he's defined Quentin Tarantino as a person. And what I think is interesting is a lot of the lasting filmmakers from the 90s have this, because I don't think a Spielberg or a Coppola could make a movie like this, and I don't think Quentin Tarantino could make what Steven Spielberg and Coppola make. And I also think this movie's uniquely a 90s film. Like, you have to be a filmmaker coming out of the 90s. I don't think a Dennis Neuville today could make something like this. It's very unique. I'm going to come up I'm going to say something, and you can disagree if you want, but I want to hear your thoughts. Around this time, Quentin Tarantino started doing a lot of writing for films. I feel like in a lot of ways, Natural Born Killers is the stupid little brother to Pulp Fiction. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe not stupid, but a little less philosophical, or
yeah,
maybe a
I
little
think it
too overtly
is.
philosophical.
Yeah, I think it's much more political. Um, I think it's. I don't know if it's fair to compare the two too much. I mean, I know Quentin Tarantino has a story credit, but to my knowledge, he doesn't have a like screenplay, like a writing credit.
No,
For Natural Born Killers. Oliver
but
Stone is a much more different is a much different filmmaker.
you feel almost like the inspiration from from fucking Oliver Stone when it comes to Natural Born
Yeah,
Killers, because I watched that one recently, and it felt very much like somebody really trying very hard to be Tarantino. But I will also say that Oliver Stone is much more. Is it unfair to call Oliver Stone more of a workman like director than Tarantino?
uh, I
I'm putting you on the spot
I
right
wouldn't
now.
I wouldn't say that. To me, like a you know
Maybe not
workman's
workman
director,
is
it's kind
unfair.
of like a director for hire kind of thing, like a John Borman, not John Borman, more of like a how do I say it without being like rude? I don't want to be rude to any like kind of filmmaker,
Right. No,
but
I get what you're saying.
um, yeah,
But
like,
he was
Oliver
more of a
Stone has a
new
very
Hollywood guy who was trying to adapt to the times, is what it feels like to me.
like
Because what did
in a
he
way,
did like
sure, because he got his
Platoon?
start in the '70s.
Platoon feels
And
very new Hollywood to me. Maybe not new
sure,
Hollywood, but I don't know.
I think Oliver Stone is much more political than I mean, shit. What was the movie he did before Natural Born Killers? Was JFK the movie he made before Natural Born Killers? Like, um, I want to say it was close. Um, because what year did Natural Born Killers? '94, right? And
Uh,
JFK would have been
Let
'91.
me look at
So
his filmography quick. Give me just a second. But
I
it
think
looks like right before that he did Heaven and Earth, which who knows, but about 3 years before Natural Born Killers was JFK. So it was the same time period for Stone that he did
let's see.
that. And
Okay,
then Platoon
yeah,
and Wall
it's kind of
Street
before
were
he.
a solid decade before Natural Born Killers and stuff was Platoon and Wall Street. So
But even then, I mean, Stone in the '80s is still very, very political. I mean, he put out Salvador the same year that Platoon came out. Those both have very distinct, not the most flattering depictions of America.
perhaps
Um,
Workman was an incorrect assessment, because looking
yeah,
at
I think
Stone's filmography, I do agree. Not Workman, but he never reached the heights of the great auteurs. I feel like I think Oliver Stone definitely has a place in cinema history. I also think maybe in the '90s he was trying to rediscover himself, and Natural Born Killers, because Natural Born Killers does not feel like it feels very like if you watch Natural Born Killers and then if I had to guess, I would be like, he's one of the Sundance kids from the '90s, like Kevin Smith or Wes Anderson or the Coens or whatever. But it's by the guy who made Platoon. Like that, it just seems weird. I don't know.
I think it's very fitting of someone like Oliver Stone to tackle something like that because he has uh, he's a little bit more provocative in the sense that like I know Quentin Tarantino's it faced a lot of public backlash for his use of violence in film. Um,
if
Right.
with Tarantino, it comes from more of a cinematic enjoyment of violence. With
No, I
Oliver
definitely agree.
Stone, it's much more like of a almost guttural kind of like,
And
disdain.
I think we
Like
saved the
the
I say we saved the conversation of Tarantino the revisionist for part 2 of this conversation, but um yeah, I don't know why that came up. I'm kind of blanking, but you know what I'm saying.
there's definitely parts to it there that I do think are there are little notes in Natural Born Killers that I do think are better expounded upon in Pulp Fiction, but I also think that that is because it's Quentin Tarantino handling, directing, and writing a full script. I mean, he has Roger Avery as a co-writer, um, but it's him handling his own material as opposed to putting it into the hands of another filmmaker. Because I
Right,
mean, like
right, right.
Tony Scott's a very different filmmaker from Quentin Tarantino, and True Romance, while it still feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie, it does not feel like it's a Quentin Tarantino script that is handled by someone else, by a very different director.
Right.
And I think you still have that very, it's very similar with
And I also feel like at the
Reservoir Dogs.
time, if you were admired by Tarantino, he would help out with your stuff. He felt more enthusiastic, perhaps in the '90s and early 2000s, to be on the film screen, and I could see him thinking somebody like Tony Scott in a lot of ways. Like I have a lot to say about Tony Scott, but I could see how the pair came together. Oliver Stone, I think, is an interesting pairing, but definitely Tony Scott. Either of the Scotts, I could see Ridley Scott, especially more modern Ridley Scott, working with Tarantino. But that's kind of besides the point. I wanted to get into Tarantino's writing a little bit, so I had to sneak that in there. I had to get you talking about it. So, what other notes do you have on Pulp Fiction before we move on to his third film?
I mean, aside from the fact that like not to sound like a walking subreddit, but it is all of the praise that is given to it is very warranted, um, and I think it's totally fair. People say that it's one of their favorite movies because it is something that is it's a very rewarding film. There's a lot there subtextually, but it's also something that can be enjoyed at face value, and I think that's something that not a lot of filmmakers can really balance in a great way, and it's something that Tarantino does very well. Um,
Right.
which, like, he he's he's good at his job, and
He
I
is.
hate when people like criticize people for liking, especially this movie. Like it's like people that like to shit on Radiohead, where I'm just like, who cares? They're
Is
objectively good. This movie's objectively good.
is Quentin Tarantino the Nickelback of
No,
filmmakers?
no, because I think that there's a lot more nuance to Quentin Tarantino than there is to Nickelback. There is a lot of um, there they can be similar in the way that like there is like this kind of showman mentality to both in terms of presentation, but I think I think it's unfair to compare film to like music.
It's two different
I know that
ballparks.
I see what you're doing, but
No, I
I'm trying
was
to spin this on you.
100% being a dick. I was 100% being a dick. I think it's impossible to compare the two mediums. Um,
um, I really like this movie. And I'm sometimes I'm embarrassed by how much I like it, but then I watch it again and I'm like, you know what? No, this works for me. Um, I do think it's one of the best films of the night. And
Yeah.
it's I would feel comfortable saying that it's one of my favorite movies of all time. I love it. I think it's great. I think it's one of those few movies, not to give like letterbox ratings like anything super serious, but I'm one of those people that's not fun with it, and I don't give 5 stars out very often.
Yeah,
Um,
no. I've noticed
this
that.
is because to me, like a 5 star, like you gotta earn it. And I think that this movie earns it. Um,
Yeah. No, I
at least
agree.
for me, it ticks all the boxes.
I'll agree.
Obviously, like
Let's
something
you know
like
what? For this podcast, let's do it. Let's rate the Tarantino films. I would also give it a 5 stars. Um and I think the reason being is not only is it kind of the if Reservoir Dogs was the impregnation of Quentin Tarantino's style, this is the baby crowning, you know what I'm saying? The
for
baby's
sure.
the baby's peeking out of that vajayjay. I'm sorry, I'm a little drunk off
What
Fireball
the
right
fuck
now.
is wrong? Where the fuck are you
I've
going?
had a couple. I've had a couple. Um, uh, I've had a couple drinks today, but
I see. Oh.
no, for
So,
sure.
Jackie Brown.
So, anyways, Jackie Brown, uh, Jackie Brown, um, I think, and I feel like every. Can you call Jackie Brown underrated when everybody in the world loves to say Jackie Brown is underrated?
No, I'm glad that you brought that up because I feel very strongly about this movie.
It is not the Quentin
I
Tarantino movie that anybody talks about, but when it is talked about, it's in the same breath as underrated because it's a
Yeah,
great movie,
to me,
but
it is kind of a litmus test for people in terms of how they feel about Jackie Brown, because um, if you I kind of love it when people say that this is his best movie. It's not my favorite
oh yeah.
by any means,
I
but I
think
also I really
look,
do love it.
depending who you are, I think there's an argument to be made that it is his best. I don't think that either. I don't think either of us would say that it is, but I really respect what he did with Jackie Brown, and I have probably more to say about it than Pulp Fiction. And even though I
Oh, me
love Pulp
too.
Fiction so much when I'm watching it, when I think of Quentin Tarantino, I'm the only one in the world who's gonna say this, but Jackie Brown pops into my head before Pulp Fiction, and this isn't me trying to be a hipster, but it's me as a classic movie fan. He attempted to revive Pam Grier's career just on the fact that he was a fan of 70s exploitation films. And I think this is when Quentin Tarantino really hits his confidence, like hits standard Tarantino, almost cocky douchebag levels of confidence, where he
Yeah.
knows he can do whatever the fuck he wants. He wants to cast. He's one of the biggest directors in the world, circa 1997 when this was made. And he just says, I'm going to cast washed up Pam Grier because I liked her in Women in Prison films.
Yeah.
That's fucking wild.
I'm glad that you talk about the kind of 70s aspect because to me, um, his 70s influence is it's apparent in every movie, but this Jackie Brown feels like a movie that could be made in the 1970s.
I agree. I definitely, obviously, that was intentional. That's not even a question. But
Yeah, it's I don't know, like the down to the um like the music and I mean the idea of this I don't know where I'm going with it. There's just something about it in terms of the the display and the pacing and the performances, and the characters, that it's just very 70s. And
It is.
I kind of love that,
And
because it is something that's very easy to emulate, but it's something that's very difficult to give the impression that it is a movie that could have been made at that time.
right. And oh man, I could go on about Jackie Brown. Man, from the cast to the performances, it's an awesome movie, and I definitely do get that 70s vibe. Obviously, again, kind of like I was saying earlier with my interpretation on him as an exploitation filmmaker, it it is a 70s film. However, it's made on a huge budget in the 90s. I mean, this
Yeah.
man was coming off of Pulp Fiction, which was a massive hit. He had his pick of the litter. He could choose what he wanted to do, when he wanted to do it, and he took that and ran. I don't
Yeah.
think he's stepped out of his comfort zone yet, like he will with Kill Bill. I don't want to say step out of his comfort zone, but he still is in the crime genre of the first three Tarantino films, and I'm excited to get into Kill Bill because I think that's when he diversifies his catalog a little bit. It is
I've
interesting.
got a lot of things to say about Kill Bill.
It
But I
is
also have a lot to say about this movie.
right.
It's something that I really do love this movie a lot. Um, I think in terms of like, I do think Reservoir Dogs are like movies that I think it's better than Reservoir Dogs, but it's something that I don't necessarily enjoy as much. And I think part of that is mostly due to nostalgia.
Sure.
But also, like, when people do say that they think that this is his best movie, I'm kind of like, okay, based, like, that is kind of an awesome pick. And like, I don't know, you can tell a lot about someone based on their feelings on this movie. Like the people that think it's one of his weaker ones, I'm just like, okay, so you're no fun.
Right.
And the people that really like it can be really annoying about it, but also I'm like, you do have good taste.
See, you know what's interesting? Considering it's an underrated Tarantino, and it's the left field pick to say it's your favorite. It's still on the weaker half of Tarantino's filmography for me, but in terms of memorability, it's up there in Tarantino's filmography, which is interesting. It really sticks with me. And I think it's really interesting what he did. He was trying to kind of lift up a lot of people in Hollywood that I think were marginalized and left behind. I think the fact that a man who just made one of the biggest hits of the 90s and one of the kind of 90s solidified classics, Pulp Fiction, would immediately go on and say, I'm going to give Pam Grier a starring vessel, a woman who hadn't been a star since the 70s, and when she was a star, she was starring in shit you would watch in
corner that she's a star of.
Right, the shit Pam Grier was playing in theaters that were a half step above the porno theater. Like,
Yeah.
come on. And he kind of revitalized her, and serious, I don't know, man. It's actually like, I love it. It's really cool. And as a fan of like 70s blaxploitation, because I love Shaft, I love Dolomite, it's a genre I've dipped into a lot. It's kind of cool, but I also think this is kind of the start of where you could make an argument that Tarantino is an exploitation filmmaker.
I think out of the two of us, you are definitely more of like a fan of like the exploitation or blaxploitation.
Yeah, in general,
you have tried many times to get me to watch like the Shaft movies, and Gordon Parks is definitely like an artist that I'm aware of. I know him more from his photography because he started out as a photojournalist,
Oh, interesting.
and had a lot to say about, like he was very active in a lot of like the civil rights movements in the 50s and the 60s in the South, and would photograph that, and has some really, like, I genuinely think he's one of the most important American photographers of the 20th century.
Right.
Um, so I know him more from that, and it's always so funny to realize that he also had a pretty extensive film career. But I do think a lot of that is based off of his experiences in the South, growing, or not growing up, but you know, yeah, creating his work there. Um,
Yeah.
but I do find a lot of that influence on Jackie Brown, and not in a way of like, I do think Quentin has a kind of questionable relationship with like black art, and uh,
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I
which is
mean,
something I do want to bring up with this, because it's something that we kind of haven't really addressed with his earlier films, is his relationship with the N word.
yeah, here's my take on it.
He leans on it quite a bit in this
He
movie.
leans on it quite a bit. He does in Pulp Fiction, he does in Django. The thing is, I think Quentin Tarantino is hard to track, it's hard to pin down because you have an interesting mixture of, on one end, he's elevating these black voices. He's bringing back Pam Grier. He's uh, probably a huge reason for Sam Jackson being one of the top 5 biggest movie stars in the world to this day.
For
He
sure.
and he's bringing back these exploitation genres, but much like a lot of the exploitation films of the 70s, these aren't made by black artists. It's white artists. It's, in this case, a white artist, but it's white artists who are using the fact that, I hate to say it, but because they're white, they got a little more pull power than the black artists, especially in the 70s,
Absolutely.
but to a lesser extent the 90s and early 2000s. And they're trying to kind of bring these old genre films into the light and bring these stars back into the light. So while there's a lot of positives, I almost think Quentin Tarantino's a little too comfortable in these worlds where he's
Yes.
using the N-word, where he's like, I feel like I got the N-word pass, you know?
Yeah, and
So
I
I
understand
don't think
that.
it comes from a place of malice. I really, based on how Quentin Tarantino acts in his movies and stuff, I don't think Quentin Tarantino's a racist. Not
No,
that I think that's too relevant to the
I would
conversation,
not.
but I, I I think he's almost a little too comfortable, where he thinks he's a little too down with the culture, or
Yes.
whatever. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
Have you seen a lot of interviews of him around this time?
No, I haven't.
It is embarrassing.
I am 100% positive, and I believe
You gotta
that
look up some
Quentin.
interviews of him around this time in print and in video. It is embarrassing.
I can imagine.
He is the textbook example of a culture vulture, or or also,
See, yeah, culture
there's a certain
vulture.
word.
Culture
There's a certain
vulture,
word
I
for
don't
him.
think is fair, and here's the reason why. I think a culture vulture takes advantage of the culture and tries to use it to his advantage. And I'm not saying Quentin Tarantino doesn't, but I also get the
He made his
vibe
entire
from
career
Quentin.
off of it.
I get the vibe from Quentin Tarantino that it comes from a place of reverence, though. And
Yes, like I said, I don't think that he is a racist.
100% from interviews that I've heard, more recent interviews, and the fact that he grabs Pangreer. He didn't just grab any sexy black woman off the street and say, "You're the one for my movie where I get to say the N word 100 times." And I think there's enough reverence that I'm willing to give Tarantino the benefit of the doubt and say that it is reverence, but it's definitely at the same time the double-edged sword, where I think he has too much reverence and perhaps too much comfortability in the world as a major filmmaker.
Yeah, and um, maybe I'm reaching here,
I'm
and not to
interested
harp
to
too
hear
much,
I'm interested to hear it.
not to harp on uh, not to harp on the spoilers too much, because I do think that there is definitely
But I do
a
think
point
it's
to be made
integral.
about two white guys talking about another white guy's use of the N word.
Okay, but in fairness, I think if
Um,
you're going to talk about Jackie Brown, if we danced around it, it would be a little.
yeah, yeah.
It, it's part of the topic for discussion. Perhaps I'm like Tarantino. I'm a little too comfortable in this world. I'm talking about shit out my ass that I have no right to talk about. But anyways, let's hear it.
Yeah, not to editorialize, but I have been watching The Sopranos again.
Great
this
show.
is
I've only seen a
this
handful of
is
episodes, but
it's my favorite show of all time. I think it's the television equivalent of the Great American Novel. I think it's wonderful. I love it very much. I've seen it. This is my third or fourth rewatch. But here's where I'm getting at is in Quentin Tarantino's films, he has the N word quite a bit in some of his films. In this case, in Jackie Brown, I think the only people that ever use that slur are black.
yeah.
And that's not the case in Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs. And there is something to say with that with The Sopranos, where multiple characters will use it to describe people of color.
Right.
In The Sopranos, I feel like it's much more deliberate in the sense that it is kind of using that language to criticize people of that world.
Right. And I think maybe I'm
And I
out
think it
of
gets danced
bounds.
over.
Maybe
in
I'm out
this.
of bounds as a white dude, but I think in terms of using it in a dramatic setting, if you are using it for criticism and not to be, cool or whatever,
Yeah, there's
I
more
think
nuance
it's
to
fine
that.
if there's nuance. And I think what you're describing in The Sopranos is a good example of how that's fair. And I think,
To be fair, The Sopranos is a
especially
much different piece of art compared
rolling
to.
back slightly to Pulp Fiction, we have Quentin Tarantino showing up as himself saying the N-word like 20 times.
Yeah,
I don't know how well that holds up compared to something like a Sopranos or even to an extent when he gets to it in Django Unchained. In a way, it felt like he found an excuse to say the N word 5 times. Is what it felt like in Pulp
yeah,
Fiction. I don't know how much criticism is actually there in Pulp
yeah.
Fiction, where it makes sense in Django. It would almost feel out of place without it in Django, especially with
Yeah,
how that plot goes. But we'll get back to that with
and,
Django. I think
and,
this is a
and here's
conversation to revisit for that
for sure.
movie.
And here's what I'll say is that I I would never tell someone what they can and can't do with their art. But at the same time, I don't have to. I don't think that watching and enjoying something is also endorsing the behavior. Okay, I don't have like a child's attitude towards media literacy. I understand why it's there. I understand the defense of it. I'm just saying, I think, to a certain extent, I don't think it belongs there. I think the conversation would be different if he wasn't white. But I also, not to kind of make a milk toast argument about it, but at the end of the day, I think it's worth being addressed, because it is. I mean, America is a different place than it was in 1997. Um, so it's just something that stuck out to me when I watched it. It didn't ruin the movie for me. I still love
Right.
this movie very much. I think that there is a lot that is very great about this. I think in terms of script, I think this is one of the best things he's ever written, which is interesting because it is the only movie. It's the only script that he ever adapted. It's
Right.
adapted from an Elmore Leonard novel, and I don't know how much you know about Elmore Leonard.
I
Um,
don't. Let's hear it.
he was like a genre fiction author. Wrote a lot of westerns, pulp, novels, crime. But he also has this really wonderful kind of like working class hero kind of prose to him, and not in the way of like a John Steinbeck where there's
Right.
something very like very classic, very very like stoic and um, like a real literature sense to it with like a John Steinbeck novel. There is something that's very kind of blue collar with the way that Elmore Leonard writes, or used to write. He's no longer alive.
Right.
Um, but he, I think it's very telling that um, Quentin Tarantino picked Rum Punch, which is the name of the novel. I don't know if I ever said that. Rum Punch as the as something to adapt because it is very in
Right.
line with his influence.
Well, the
And
next
I think he does
closest
it.
thing for to an adaptation he has is Django, which is a spiritual remake of the Django name, which was a series of spaghetti
Yeah,
westerns. Um,
yeah,
but again, we'll get into that later. I just wanted to note that as much as Quentin Tarantino wears his influences on his sleeve, what I think is interesting is that Tarantino hasn't adapted really much of anything except for this movie and to the most minor extent in the world, Django.
yeah. I think it's a really wonderful adaptation. Um,
Really, have you read
you
the
know,
book, or are you just kind
yeah,
of like slightly familiar?
yes, it is. It is. I've read this, and um, did you ever see Get Shorty?
Get Shorty. I don't believe I have.
John Travolta. Um, it was in the '90s. He plays like uh, he's like a gangster. It is very much them trying to kind of recap or benefit from um, like John Travolta's kind of resurgence as a movie star after Pulp
Right.
Fiction, and that's also an Elmore Leonard novel. It's good.
Interesting.
I like it. Um, I also read that book. Those are the only two Elmore Leonard novels I've read, but I know um, he wrote some short stories that um, the 310 to Yuma was based off of,
Oh,
and
wait. For real? The
yeah,
original movie? I mean, I guess both movies in a way.
yeah, that was a short
So
story,
I'm interested
and
to
then he
hear
also
do you know with 310 to Yuma because I know like The Thing was based on a book um and then John Carpenter's Thing was also based on the book. But kind of it wasn't really a remake of the movie, more the book. Is that how
yeah, the short
310 to
story.
Yuma was?
Yeah, I mean it started as a short. Um, it was published as a short that then became a film in what like the late
50s,
50s. I want to say like
yeah.
56, 57.
And then there was
And then
the
there was the
Bale
remake.
and the Christian Bale
Yeah,
and Kurt,
the
not
James
Kurt
Mangold
Russell. It
one.
was fucking
Russell
God,
Crowe.
Russell Crowe. Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he also had a short story that I'm blanking on the name of, but it was kind of what initially became the television show Justified. So he's like this
Interesting.
real like big proponent of like genre fiction. I don't want to get too into it. I just want to say that I think it is a really wonderful adaptation, and I think it's very telling that this is the only thing that he adapted strictly, like clearly, because
Right.
Django is still technically an original screenplay, despite having like very heavy influence.
No, because
Um,
Django is 100% spiritually adapted. It was a
yeah,
common theme because Django was public domain for people to make things in the quote unquote Django series, but really it was just kind of following the naming convention because the name was popular type of thing.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think it might be my favorite script of his. I love it very much. Um, I think it is it's wonderfully like tense, which is something that he's always been good at is tension.
Right.
But
He's
like Sam
always
Jackson in this movie is legitimately like intimidating and imposing and like a serious threat. And to balance that with some really like genuinely like terrific humor, like Michael Keaton in this movie.
I
Can I just
always
take a side
forget
note and just
Michael
say,
Keaton's in this movie.
yeah, you always kind of forget, but then he shows up and he is fantastic.
Right, because this is another thing where Michael Keaton was kind of this is before Michael Keaton's resurgence because Keaton was popular in the 80s and early 90s, and then he kind of had his time off, and then he sort of didn't become big again until Birdman. Not
Yeah,
that he
people know him
wasn't
as
around per
yeah,
se, but yeah, that's really cool. I keep forgetting he's in
but
the movie, to be honest with you.
people also kind of forget that he started out in comedies because
Right.
he's got wonderful comedic timing. I love Michael Keaton. Anytime he shows up in a movie, I'm kind of like, all right, yeah, hell yeah, dude. um, and I really think that this has some of the best, or maybe not the best, but my personal favorite performances. Um, Quentin Tarantino's works. Pam Grier is wonderful. In this movie, Jackie Brown has this really wonderful sadness to her. I love how everyone in this movie is kind of pathetic. Um, she's very down on her luck. She's been kind of screwed over. Um, and Keaton, De Niro, they're both kind of dopey in a way. Um, Sam Jackson is kind of this like he
Can I
thinks he's
just
a
say
lot
what
more.
a good fucking cast too?
It's wonderful. It's like beautifully done. Sam Jackson is like it, he thinks he's a lot more dangerous and high level than he actually is. Um, and I'm saving the best for last because I really want to give like a specific like shout out to Robert Forster as Max Cherry. I think
Right.
out of every Quentin Tarantino film, Max Cherry might be my favorite character in any of his movies. He is a really wonderful character, and Robert Forster gives such a really beautiful performance. There's this wonderful sadness to him that is not pathetic as not in terms of like Jackie Brown um or Dell or Lewis. Max has this. I mean,
Right.
he's he's his own boss. He owns his own successful bail bonds business, but he is tired of it. He's got this like thinning. He feels like he's too old and schlubby, and he wants to do something else with his life. And here comes this woman that he is just like absolutely floored with, and Robert Forster plays it so wonderfully. Like I genuinely believe that he is in love with Pam Grier, because he has this look to his eyes, like the way he has this sadness about him. It
Right.
it it goes away when she's around him, and it's so wonderful and so sad and so like
Yeah, no.
I love this character so much. I love this performance.
I agree. Yeah, no. Robert Forster's great in this film.
I believe he was nominated for an Academy Award for it. Yes, I know for a fact he was, because there was '97. He lost to Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, who is also great. But it's one of those times, like I don't give award shows like the Oscars and stuff, like I don't give them a ton of weight. I think they're just fun more than anything.
Right.
But it's one of those instances where I'm like, it's really too bad that they can only give out one.
Right, exactly.
Because he is so just wonderful in that movie. I could watch it just for him, because he is such a treat to watch in this movie, and I'm very thankful that it exists, and I'm very thankful that Quentin. That's something that I don't know if we've talked about yet. Is that Quentin really clearly loves actors.
Right. I think, I mean, we touched on it to an extent with like Pam Grier, but
Yeah,
he has a set of actors he really loves, and you can tell I don't know if idolizes is the correct word, but he has a big heart for, and he says,
especially the character actor.
yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Like the people who never had like their moment to shine.
Right. I mean,
aside from Travolta, who was a big star in the '70s, and then towards the '80s kind of started to fall off. But aside from that, like he really does put a lot of love and care into these smaller actors who he feels like haven't gotten their like their time in the spotlight, and I love that.
no, I agree.
Because I am so thankful that I get to live in a world where this performance exists, and that it's it's immortalized essentially on film, because it's one of my favorite performances ever.
Right.
I could talk about it forever.
No, I think one thing I will say about this movie is it really is a film that's carried by the performances, but on top of that, like cinematically structured, it's just amazing. I could talk about Jackie Brown all day, and I almost I don't think it's unfair for me to say that I almost slightly prefer it to Pulp Fiction. I still think, like, I don't know, man. Like, to me, it just sticks out. It stays in my memory so well. And just kind of hearing how it was a man on the top of his game making this movie and bringing back a lot of people against the odds, and kind of making a film that he wanted to make, not necessarily for commercial success, because commercially, critically, and perhaps culturally, it's been left behind compared to a lot of his early work. Because obviously we're talking about the early half of his career right now. But I definitely think out of the 5 films we're talking about today, it's the most forgotten about. But what I think is interesting is, like, to me, I think it's such a milestone of somebody sacrificing a bit of his clout to try to raise up a bunch of forgotten artists who I think still had more to say, be it Robert Forster or Pam Grier, or he even brings some big actors into the fray who I think had stuff to say in this movie as well, be it De Niro or Sam Jackson. And it was awesome.
Not to gloss over Robert De Niro, but he is also really wonderful in this movie. It's very fun to see him kind of play a loser for once.
Right. Because De Niro is kind of, in a lot of the movies, he tends to play roles that are the wise older man these days, or in the 70s, he was tough guy, street genius.
Yeah.
So to see him kind of play a schlub was kind of a fun, I don't know if rug pull's the right word, but change of pace for sure.
Yeah. I'll put it this way. I just watched The Godfather Part 2 for the first time. I've seen the first one many, many times.
Right.
And for whatever reason, I never watched 2
Part
and 3.
2 is amazing. For me, it's Part 2 is 100 times better than Part 1. Part 1 is a near perfect film. and part 3 is okay.
I
But
love
I've
them
only
both.
seen.
I enjoy all
I
three.
I saw you watch part 3 either today or yesterday. I can't remember, but I have to ask: did you watch the restoration that came out a couple years ago, or did you watch the standard part
Um,
3?
no, I watched the director's cut from 1991.
Oh, so you didn't watch the Mario Puza novel
The
cut, did you?
No, I didn't watch the coda. Um,
I watched the
I
coda. I've
watched.
never seen the original
I would like to
or
eventually watch it.
the standard director's cut. But you know how
I'm kind
Coppola
of
is with his director's cuts.
for sure. I'm kind of Godfathered out right now, but it is something I will go back to eventually. But I do want to just make my point about Godfather 2, without
Yeah, let's hear it.
like completely derailing the conversation. I wanted to point out that like the about halfway through the movie with the veto segments, like the prequel part, I
Yeah,
kind of forgot that I was watching Robert De Niro. Where I was like, oh shit, like that's Robert De Niro. I had the same reaction with Al Pacino, but that same revelation I had when I realized I was watching Robert De Niro, is the same. It did remind me of watching Jackie Brown for the first time and kind
really.
of forgetting that Robert De Niro was was uh, was playing
Well,
Lewis.
just to talk up the
It's just a really
Godfather,
wonderful performance.
just to talk up the Godfather even more than than anybody needs to. Let's be honest. You look at Pacino. You look at fucking Robert De Niro. You look at Marlon Brando. You watch these movies and you forget it's Brando. You forget it's De Niro and you forget it's
Yeah,
Pacino. And that's what I really love about the Godfather movies. Wholly unrelated to maybe a couple years down the line
Connor,
we can do an
you're gonna run
episode.
out of podcast episodes.
Dude, I gotta keep finding episodes. I would love to do one on the Godfather trilogy because I would rewatch these movies. I could talk for Godfather length. I could do a Godfather length episode about this, and that's why I have 20 co-hosts. Is because my original co-host, God rest his soul, and and because I feel like I have a diverse number of ideas. Like I can get deep with film with you, and Colin loves the comics. Man, it's awesome. It's a good time. So I appreciate it because you're one of the few people I know who can go head to head with me on films.
I appreciate that.
I love
Yeah,
going head to head on films and talking the philosophy.
it's a
Um,
lot more fun when it's movies that you really like Jackie Brown.
yeah, no, Jackie Brown is a great film, and I feel like talking about it with you, I like it even more. And it's been a while since I've watched it, but I'm looking back and I'm rewatching the movie in my head, and I'm like, God damn, everybody says it's the underrated Quentin Tarantino movie to the point where you question if it's actually underrated. But genuinely, like when you hear people talk about like what nobody's favorite Tarantino film is Jackie Brown, perhaps it deserves it, man.
Yeah, I
Perhaps it
think it
deserves to be the favorite.
deserves. I think it deserves to be in the conversation of his great movie. Um,
Because I didn't go into Jackie Brown thinking this might be my favorite, and I didn't leave it having a hipster mindset, but talking about it, I'm like, that's a really fucking good movie, man. It really
yeah,
is.
it's wonderful. It is. Yeah, I I love it to death. Yeah, I it's just a great movie. Um,
Right.
yeah, I yeah, I'm gonna level with you. Any time you have a movie that has even some kind of hint of there being a heist, I'm probably gonna enjoy it.
Oh, I
Um,
love
where
heists.
to
Italian
where
Job, both versions.
I love this heist in this movie. It's such a fun spin where like it's not sexy. It's there's nothing like super alluring about it. It's not like they're going big or going home. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's like what? It's like I can't remember the total amount of money that they end up stealing from
Right.
Riddell, but I know it's
It's not like the Ocean's
Everything.
11 movie where it's the Ocean's movies where it's a romantic. We're gonna steal $250 million from the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas. You know, it's not like that. It's a totally different vibe.
Yeah,
And I
it's in the
love
grand scheme
heist
of
movies,
things.
but a lot of heist movies are some of you know a crazy amount, and they come up with the craziest heist to get it. Jackie Brown feels like I I could be involved in this heist. You know, it's
Yeah,
just it doesn't take me rappelling down a rope, hanging over a laser beam while the diamond sits there,
yeah, and
ready
the
for me
people
to
who,
grab. It's real smash and grab.
yeah,
I'm not
it's not the
saying it's a
diamond
dumb
heist.
heist, but it's definitely you know it's more of a smash and grab job. It's
Yeah, it's
and
not the
Quentin.
diamond heist from Rafifi. It's your perpetrators are two schlubby losers that that make it out. But I love that it's also successful, and I love the presentation of it. It's kind of like almost this like Rashomon style presentation where you get everyone's different perspective.
Right.
Um, it's
That's a good
it's a lot
comparison.
of fun. I think it's a lot of fun, and I'm always locked in when that part of the movie happens.
Yeah. So I guess I just to wrap up our Jackie Brown discussion, unless you have anything else pressing. Um, I've kind of like so far we've just kind of ended up doing our letterbox ratings, and I think this is one of the more underrated one of the more underrated Tarantino films. I mean I know I just gave a 5 to Pulp Fiction, but I'd give Jackie Brown a 5, man. 5 out of 5. Like I love Jackie Brown. I think it's such a unique film. I think it's great what Tarantino is doing for kind of the forgotten stars of yesteryear, maybe kind of giving them their time to shine. He had the spotlight and he wanted to share it with people he loved. Like I think that's great. I think Jackie Brown is underrated, and I definitely think it's an easy film to skip if you're just skimming his filmography. But I don't think it is a film to skip if you're skimming his
Uh,
filmography. I think it's
no, it
definitely
it
worth a watch.
it deserves to be a part of the conversation. Um, I have it sitting at like a an 8 out of 10, or a
Sure,
4
and I
on
think that's
Letterboxd.
perfectly fair. I think a lot of what lifts my rating is the fact that he's brought back people like Pam Grier and has I'm sorry, not John Travolta, Robert De Niro in a role that's unconventional for him.
Yeah, I enjoy this movie more and more every time I see it. I can only see it kind of going up if I'm gonna give it like a score.
Right.
Um, but I do really love it.
All right. Well, we're
I
almost
mean,
at.
I guess I should say like an 8, or I guess like a 4 on Letterboxd. To me, that's earned. Anything that's 3.5 and above is earned. Um, so when it's like
Right. Well, you're a
a 4 and
harsher
above
critic
is
than
something that
me. See, I don't know how my letterboxed slope is so slopey. But I very much go by the feeling I get from a movie. I think you're a harsher critic than I am. I go by the
Yeah,
feeling.
I don't know why. It's not like, yeah, I mean part of
Part of
mine
it
is also like a feeling, but I don't know why I'm so stingy with like the high rating. I guess I don't know.
I'll tell you.
I
I think part a lot of I think 60% of mine is like the technical film and 40% is the feeling. For example, I just watched the new Liam Neeson movie today. Objective half star. Terrible acting, terrible story, barely a movie. But I had so much fun for no reason that I gave it a 2.5. Now, if you watched Retribution by Liam Neeson, I would estimate at highest you'd give it a star and a half.
it,
Realistically.
it may be.
Realistically, it's not great. But I had so much fun. I was laughing not with the movie, but at the movie. And and you know what else made it even more fun? perhaps it was the theatrical experience, because there were two elderly women behind us in the theater, the only other two people on a Saturday afternoon watching Retribution with Liam Neeson, and they were laughing their asses off too. Not because the movie was good, but because the dialogue was so garbage along with the acting. And something about that just made one of the most memorable movie experiences. And you can't forget something like that.
Hey, that's the power of cinema, baby.
Yeah, it's the power of cinema. I don't know how that has anything to do with Liam Neeson, but what I'm trying, or with Quentin Tarantino, but what I'm trying to say is I understand why you gave Jackie Brown a 4. I would just give it a 5.
I don't know. I don't get. Yeah, I don't want to be like one of those people that's like I take Letterboxd seriously. I really don't. I like using it as a means to like log what I watch and put down like, when I watched it, this is how I was feeling.
I think we use it similarly to where it's like I catalog what movies I've watched, but also it's 100% like, how did I feel watching this movie? I'm not going to pretend to be Pauline Kael on Letterboxd. I'm not a smart reviewer. Don't take my fucking opinions seriously. If you have a similar opinion, I might be a good resource, but I'm not, you know what I'm saying? I'm not. Don't take what I say fucking seriously. I'm just a guy. I don't matter.
Yeah. It's just for fun.
Anyways,
and speaking of fun,
Kill Bill.
Kill Bill.
I was about to transition into Kill Bill myself. I think we should kind of talk about Kill Bill 1 and 2 as one entity, just because not only are we already at over 2 hours of talk time, probably about an hour and 50
hey,
with editing.
Get ready to talk for another 2 hours, because I'm gonna full disclosure. 2 things. One, I used to get annoyed when Quentin Tarantino would refer to Kill Bill as one movie. In my old age, I've come to embrace that, because it should be viewed as one movie.
Even so, I just think here's the thing. I consider it 2 movies still. I would never rate the movies together or something like that. However, Quentin, if it was a different director, maybe I'd consider it a movie and its sequel. But based on how Quentin Tarantino operates, I think the 2 parts are so married that it's hard not to talk largely about the 2 as a separate entity, because he was in the Kill Bill mind space when he made both parts. He's not like some directors.
It was also filmed as one movie. It was always intended to be released as one movie, and then Weinstein, who we have not talked about at all.
Yay, Harvey Weinstein! Everybody, give him a round of applause.
Maybe we can talk about him in part 2, because I do think that there is more to be said about him.
I think part 2 is more poignant because he had a closer relationship with Weinstein in the later part of his career, up till obviously Harvey Weinstein was pulled out of the picture. I that'll be a topic of part 2, so stay tuned. But let's talk about Kill Bill and finish off this kind of Miramax era of Tarantino.
Well, I just want to start up. Full disclosure, I love both parts. To me, Kill Bill, like Volume 1 and 2, it is just one movie. And that being said, I think it's his best. I think this is Quentin Tarantino at on a technical standpoint. I think this is him using every ounce of knowledge and experience and creativity to his fullest extent. And I also think it is his most poignant and sentimental
Grant,
film.
I'm gonna be holy controversial here. And here's my thing about Kill Bill Part 1 and 2. It's one of my least favorite works by Tarantino. It is one of my least favorite to return to. And I don't think it's bad, because I think most of what Quentin Tarantino did, even though I don't think Tarantino's the deepest directors, I think they're good. Here's my thing. I watch a lot of Asian cinema, and I think this adopts styles from both Japanese and Chinese cinema, where you have kind of a hybrid of like the samurai film and the martial arts film. And I think I've seen both so much better, or maybe just so many times that by the time I see Quentin Tarantino kind of marry the style of Kurosawa and the Shaw brothers, or Bruce Lee, or whoever you want to compare him to, by the time I see Tarantino, a white dude, marry the style, it it takes me out a little bit. I'm not saying the movie's not sentimental, and I'm not saying there's not a lot to it, but I almost prefer Tarantino when he's dipping in the crime or westerns worlds than in the martial arts samurai world. Just because
those are great.
Yeah, I just feel like I've seen other people do it more authentically or better. And I'm not saying Kill Bill's bad, because as much as I want to shit on Tarantino, he's an amazing director. He's amazingly consistent, and I like these movies, but they still fall on the lower part of my ranking for Tarantino.
Fascinating. Yeah.
But I want to hear your thoughts
disagree.
on it.
I fucking love this movie so much. I think it's the most entertaining for me. I'm never bored when I watch it. I am always glued into it. I watched this movie both parts earlier this year, and immediately after I was done with part 2, the day after, I just watched both parts again, because I love it so much. I think it is him. I think his influences, like Kurosawa and Sergio Leone and Bruce Lee, stuff like that. They all do it better, but I think that this is him at the top of his game. Just because he is pulling from all these influences and really like recreating or paying homage to them to such an extent that it is
okay. And to your point, I think it's 100% fair to say that Tarantino's a master at juggling all these different styles. Like, he masterfully juggles 5 different movies and merges it into Kill Bill. Which I think is completely fair praise of the film.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it might be the most important film he ever made. From a couple things, on a technical standpoint, this is the first film he did with Robert Richardson, who is one of my favorite cinematographers, but he's also worked on every single Quentin Tarantino movie after this, since aside from Death Proof. And about 2 hours ago, when we started this conversation, you had said something about his approach and style having almost a cartoony approach to it, especially in later movies. I think it really is exemplified once him and Robert Richardson started collaborating.
Interesting.
Because there's a lot of like expressive lighting that Richardson brings to a lot of his movies. He's got this very like harsh overhead lighting that is very like, it's not practical. You wouldn't see it in like a normal building or setting like in real life, but it just makes it so obvious that you're watching a movie, and I kind of love that. There's lots of snap zooms in this movie that definitely kind of is like a staple later on. It's just so, there's so much energy to it, and in such a different way from like Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs and Jackie Brown.
Right.
It is so kinetic and like just and it really, to me, it works. It clicks all the boxes for me. It is exciting. It's such a visual treat to watch. And it's so colorful in like these beautifully, it's like beautifully saturated. And it's got this really wonderful, like, just beautiful, like, aesthetic that I love.
Right, and you know what else I think is kind of interesting is I feel like it has it is kind of the first time Tarantino stepped out of the crime genre. He wanted to prove he could be more than just a crime filmmaker. Which I think is good. Like, you want the variety. It kind of, I mean, you have I'm not going to say Tarantino has stepped out of the shadow of crime film, but you look at someone like a Scorsese, who in a lot of ways is the Tarantino of like new Hollywood. If we're
Who
going to compare
collaborated quite a bit with
people,
Robert Richardson, also.
yeah, that is true.
They
But
they did quite a few films together.
but I just mean like it's him stepping out of his comfort zone a little bit.
Yeah. He is pulling from all different sorts of influences with spaghetti westerns, from Italian spaghetti westerns, black exploitation, and South Asian cinema. Like Lady Snowblood is a huge influence on this movie, and to the point where, like, I know Criterion has released both films. And if it weren't for Kill Bill, I would not have seen those movies, and I really love them, and I can see the blatant, like, homage to them. I mean, they
Right.
even use he uses the Lady Snowblood theme in this movie after in part one, after he kills Oren, who is such a great character, and I love that. I love that it's so, because it comes from this place of, like, love and appreciation, in a sense that has been very present in all of his movies, but for whatever reason in this one it, like, sticks out like a sore thumb for me,
Right.
in the best way possible. I love the collaboration with the RZA, who did, like, who supervised the music in this movie. I love
Good
like
choice. I mean, the RZA also has similar influences of samurai and
Absolutely.
martial arts movies, so it's almost a natural pairing. Not to get into music too much again, we're kind of falling back into that category, but the Wu-Tang Clan, it wouldn't be unfair to consider, kind of growing up on that same 90s energy as Tarantino. I'm not going to say they're entirely related, but the RZA and
Both
Tarantino
massive cultural figureheads of their respective medium.
Yes,
in the 90s.
exactly. And yeah, I was going to say they came up around the same time. And
Yeah.
they both have, even though their art is apple and oranges, it is kind of interesting that
Absolutely.
they have similar influences. So I think that's a great pairing, the RZA and Quentin. And I know both of them had both collaborated on projects like, I believe it's called like White Fist or something later on, martial arts.
The RZA directed a martial arts film, The Man with the Iron Fist, that Quentin
that's what I
Tarantino
meant.
produced. They there is, like, a connection there that they've had since. I don't think the RZA has ever worked on anything after Kill Bill, but there's clearly, like, a collaboration and, like, appreciation for each other's work.
Tarantino moved away from stuff the RZA would particularly be interested in post Kill Bill. I'm sure if Tarantino wanted to make another pseudo samurai martial arts film, the RZA would be there.
For sure. Even aside from, like, the technical aspect, I think that this is the most layered and complex script he's ever written subtext wise. Textually, it's very simple. It's just your basic revenge movie, but there is so much there. It seems very reactive to um, his attitude towards violence.
Yeah.
Whereas he has this. Quentin talks about movie violence as like this great thing because it's not real and it's fun and it's pretend, and that's what's so fun about it. You would not get that impression, I think, just from watching this movie. I mean, it is like gleefully violent, especially part one,
Yeah.
but the bride's reaction to violence is very like there's a lot of nuance to it where we only see her after she's been betrayed by her former colleagues, but she used to be an assassin, and post waking up from a coma where she's lost her child supposedly, she has this almost this change, this attitude towards violence. I think that you would see with like someone who was like an assassin. It's very quick to all of the people that she wants to get her revenge on. Like when she kills Vernita Green, it's very quick. Oren, it's very quick, and she has this kind of like somber attitude, and also I picked up on this almost this like reaction to violence and how it affects children,
Right.
because she seems very remorseful that she had to kill Vernita Green in front of her child.
Right. Yeah.
And then sets that precedent where she's like, I took something from you, and I'll give you the chance to do that when you're older. To where almost like she's really coming to terms with her actions and the life that she chose. And you see it again with like the origin of Oren Ishii, which is like that really fantastic animated sequence, but how her witnessing her parents' deaths has like turned her into this brutal, just monster. And it's again like to keep coming back to it is like when the bride is having her standoff with the crazy 88, and specifically is like fighting Gogo, when she eventually like overpowers her and kills her. Gogo's like 16, 17 years old, and there is like again this like somber reaction to having to resort to this kind of horrible violence towards children. And you see it again with like at the end of the Crazy 88 brawl, where there's the scared kid that she like cuts his sword down and then takes him and like spanks him with the flat end of her sword, and she's like, this is what you get for fucking with the Yakuzas, like go home to your mother. And there's something there, like the whole attitude of go home to your mother, aside from this attitude, this like father-son dynamic in Reservoir Dogs, there isn't much of a presence of like fatherhood
in
a lot of his movies.
Well, here's the
whereas
thing.
Like, there's a more
as
nurturing...
far as I know, he grew up with a stepfather. He didn't really know his father. I don't know if that ties into
just about to ask you, do you know much about his father? Because his mother is the one who raised him and nurtured his love of cinema.
And his father was kind of a wannabe actor. His father ended up doing a couple film roles, mostly off the last name, sort of the same style as like Sean Connery's brother, or a lot of the kind of siblings and fathers. But my understanding from what I've heard is he's in interviews with Tarantino is that his father was kind of a deadbeat, and I almost wonder if that's influenced his world. And also going back to what we were talking about earlier with the kind of strong, I don't want to say strong women because that's an oversimplification, but with just women in Tarantino's cinema, I wonder if that has to do with the fact that he didn't have a super strong father figure, that women play an important aspect into his life, even though occasionally with like the feet stuff we were talking about, and I said I wouldn't mention it, but it's fairly exploitative. But I would be interested to know if that's part of the reason why he has so many female characters, is that Tarantino lived life through a very female perspective, given the fact that his father wasn't around and stuff. But I think this is almost tabloid speculation, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but I do think that that's worth mentioning for sure.
Yeah, I think it's very much there is his reverence for motherhood and like a strong female presence, because it
Right.
seems to me like from everything that we know, that was
I mean,
much more apparent than like a strong male presence in his life.
not to get ahead of ourselves too much, but Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has a female character that is very independent and free, almost to the point where he's commenting on a woman pre-motherhood, wherein you have Kill Bill, which much Uma Thurman's character feels very much kind of like a mother goose and a protector. And I'm curious if Uma Thurman's character was more of a comment on his mother than, say, some of his later female characters.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would agree. It's I don't know. It really stands out to me when I watch this movie that it's not like anti men, but there's definitely kind of this like reaction to like
It doesn't
fatherhood
feel
as opposed to
anti men. It feels very
yeah.
pro female. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Because I mean, Bill takes BB, who is his daughter, but he's still this, this antagonist. And Bill's presence is very much this. It's very clear to me that it's like a metaphor for like an abusive relationship,
Yeah,
or maybe not a metaphor. It's like it's an example of this like horrible relationship. He's a manipulator. I mean, his code name is Snake Charmer in terms of like the Deadly Viper Assassination Squad. That he's named all of his other people, after snakes, and this I don't know, like he's very manipulative. He's possessive. He his whole reaction to Beatrix Kiddo, the bride, running away and getting married and trying to get out of the assassin game, his response is to just to murder a bunch of innocent people in a church and put a bullet in the head of this woman that he loves who's carrying his child.
right.
And like,
yeah, I almost
at
wonder
that
how
point-
much of that is based on Tarantino
and
himself.
after part one, this is just something I noticed. Most of the like really violent stuff is either very quick, and edited creatively, or it happens almost entirely off screen, where it's like suggested. I think like the most, overtly violent thing that happens in part two is Elle getting her eye ripped out, but even then it's very quick, and it's like Beatrix just leaves her after that, to where
Right.
almost like she's not worth it. She doesn't. She's the only person that she allows to not have this like quick death, and almost in a way of like there's not this level of respect like in the way that Vernita and Oren gave her. Even Bud, who has this respect and reverence for Beatrix, he isn't killed by her, but he even has like a quicker death than Elle, who we never see officially die, like on screen. I think it's very like I know at the end there's like this cheeky little end credit thing where there's like a question mark over her name, like, oh, is she really dead? But to me, I think that character is it's implied that she's not gonna make it out. I mean, she's lost both eyes. She's stuck in a trailer with a black mamba. Like
Right.
it's you know, but and even when she kills Bill, she does it in a way of she sheathes his sword and does like the little 5-point exploding palm or heart palm technique, and he's allowed this like graceful death with respect and reverence, to the point where there's no animosity towards him at the end, where he has like there's this really wonderful exchange that it's like he before he kind of takes his steps, he says something like, how do I look? And she responds with, you look ready. And there's this like moment of catharsis afterwards where it like washes over her the next scene where she's like in tears and is finally
Right.
allowed to like be free of this abusive relationship. And I don't know, it's so touching to me.
No,
Like it's very wonderful. I love it very much.
Yeah, no, I can tell. No, I agree. I think there is a lot of like, I think there's a lot of interesting themes to Kill Bill, and you've sold me on the film a lot more than I was before. Um, I I definitely think it's one of the more interesting films, and I think it's a great example of a film that takes. I don't think it ever says something particularly unique, but it takes so much from other sources to the point where it is unique. It's uniquely derivative of a million things. He masterfully juggles this huge pot of different sources and kind of makes something unique. And on top of that, with kind of your commentary, I actually think that I'm interested. It's kind of sold me on rewatching them and kind of trying to give them another chance, because you look at it from a very basic end that I think most viewers would look at it from, and you would think, well, it's kind of your bare basic martial arts samurai combination. But I also think, especially kind of getting more background on Tarantino since I've last watched these films, that might add a layer of context that I hadn't watched before, especially with Uma Thurman's character almost feeling like a commentary on Tarantino and his mother. This is kind of the best example of his home life put to film, as much as it is interpretive. So I'm interested to rewatch it. Actually, it's been a while.
I think it's worth a rewatch. I used to be in the camp that part 2 was not as strong as part 1, but you can't have one without the other. I mean, upon rewatch of this film earlier this year, I've like done a complete 180. I think it's wonderful. To the point, I give not to skip ahead, but I gave both parts 5 stars, like 10 out of 10. I love this movie to death. I think it's his best. It's not my favorite, which we'll get to. But I could talk about this movie forever.
See, I feel like I've really undersold this on the podcast. I've given both of these. I gave part 1 a 4.5 stars and part 2 a 4. I really like these films. I really like Quentin Tarantino in general, as much as I hate to admit it. And I almost feel like there's calibers of
I kind of
enjoying
realize
films.
I really love his movies.
Yeah, no, I've never been somebody who's like I have to hate Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for me, I love the genres he touches. I love samurai films. I love martial arts films. I love crime films. I love 70s films. I love 80s films. Me and Tarantino have similar interests in films, so the fact that he was able to do them with these super high budgets and kind of with the same reverence I have for people like Pam Grier, I feel like especially early Tarantino I very much enjoy. And when he gets onto his Western era, it's like, fuck, dude, I love Westerns too. So
Yeah.
it's somebody who's able to look at the history of whatever
He's just
kind
a
of
big.
genre he's adapting and and do it with the benefit of hindsight and remix these movies into the best possible remix you can be with the benefit of hindsight, and it's awesome. It's awesome every time, and especially based on the type of film watcher I am, like it works so well for me. So that's why
Yeah.
I think
Same.
like I rate almost every Tarantino movie incredibly highly, even though unfortunately and ironically he's not one of my favorites because I don't think Quentin Tarantino is the most original filmmaker in the world. He takes so much from his influences, but he's really good at remixing things I love to the point where
Yeah.
I don't give a Quentin Tarantino movie a bad score. I haven't yet.
No, in terms of like filmmakers, like filmographies, he's one of like my. In terms of Letterboxd, I'm just kind of like looking at my averages, and he's probably my highest rated filmmaker over how many films of his I've seen and rated.
Right.
Um,
It's
which is kind of
hard.
crazy because I don't think I would consider him one of my favorites. Like someone like the Coen brothers or David Fincher or Michael Mann,
Well,
or Park Chan Wook.
a lot of those people take bigger risks. I don't think Tarantino is a risky guy. Yeah, but then at the same time, you look at a movie like Jackie
Which
Brown, and he
I mean,
is. It's interesting. I don't
we'll
know
also
what to say.
look at something like The Hateful Eight, which I know we'll get to, but I mean that's a movie, or even the next movie on the list, Death Proof. Like I would consider him to be a little bit of a risk taker.
I mean, I look at
Um,
my top-rated directors. Here's a few of mine: Wong Kar-wai, who is a fucking master; Stanley Kubrick, um, and then it's basically Quentin Tarantino and the Coen brothers. Like those are like the four that come to mind when I look at my highest rated directors.
yeah, it's interesting. Um,
Kurosawa's for sure up there because I love Kurosawa, but even yeah, I will say Quentin Tarantino is probably the riskiest of those directors that I
for
listed
sure.
in terms of I'm gonna do something that's out of my comfort zone and make it my own. And he's great at saying this might be out of my comfort zone, but I'm making it my own. And he does a great job, which I think we're especially going to have to talk about in part 2 here.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I guess maybe to just wrap up the Kill Bill conversation, is I think, the one thing I love about this is this and Jake both have a lot of heart and humanity to them that his two previous films before those kind of lack in a way. They have tons of personality, but Jackie Brown and Kill Bill have this like sentimentality and like this melancholy to them that I really resonate with because it is this like it seems like a very personal side of him that I really love. I really love seeing. I love. I don't think we've talked about. We kind of said it before that he kind of collaborates with a lot of people. Like I talked about Robert Richardson, but we haven't given any credit to Sally Menke. who
Yeah.
has been who was his editor on everything up to Inglorious Bastards, which is, once we get to Django, I'll have something to talk about with her more. But I love that he has this wonderful relationship with his editor, because she is kind of key to what makes a lot of his movies great. Um, which is something that's part of what I'll get onto later. But I think he not only does he love, working with a lot of the same people, but he also knows what he's got when he's got it, and I think that
Right.
that's really great. But I love how
Quentin Tarantino's never given me the vibe of one of those directors that kind of edit while they film, if that makes sense. There's some editors that really make it so you can't edit the editor, he's putting shit together. He or she is putting shit together, but not really have much control over it. Tarantino's always felt like a guy who shot more than he needed, and then lets the editor and himself kind of come up with the story from there.
for sure, yeah. And I love that. I love he clearly has a lot of trust in the people that he surrounds himself with. And I think that is very apparent with his cast, because I love the end credits of part 2, where it's got all the pretty much anyone that has any kind of dialogue or some kind of, prolonged screen presence in both parts of Kill Bill, where like their name is displayed in this big font with like, their character, their them on screen.
Right.
And I love the way it ends with Uma Thurman specifically, where it's like all this stuff where it's like Uma Thurman, who played Beatrix Kiddo, aka the Bride, aka Black Mamba, aka Mommy, which is really sweet. Which I feel like you don't get that with a lot of Tarantino stuff.
No, I
but
agree.
also I love how it ends with like it's like, based on stories written by Q and U, which is very, very, very sweet. Like there's definitely like this love there, and it is a little unfortunate that they stopped working together after this, based on I don't know if you've read up on like the controversy around this movie, where Uma Thurman felt like she was pressured by Weinstein and Tarantino to drive a car to get a shot on some unsafe road, where she went off road and hit a tree and got pretty banged up, and that really did taint their working relationship, which is unfortunate. Right. Because I think that there is a lot of love there from each other to each other.
I think that's definitely. I think that the and I think this will come back up in the conversation, but I definitely think we've been running pretty long, but I think based on how I think it's worth talking about the Tarantino Epstein relationship. I don't want to get into gossip column bullshit in the second part of this, but I definitely think that's something that it's an elephant in the room, kind of like Quentin Tarantino's feet obsession or something, and not to downplay it to this fact, to something as stupid as Tarantino's foot fetish, but
I think
it's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed.
There's more weight to it than the feet thing.
100%.
Which is a tired conversation.
Because the foot fetish is such a bare basic. And at the end of the day, who cares that much about the foot fetish? You can argue about the exploitation nature of the foot fetish thing to an extent. But at the same time, I don't hear a lot of the ladies yet, at least, coming out saying, I felt pressured to show my feet in Tarantino's films. It's something that fascinates the director, and as somewhat weird it is. However, something like a Weinstein, I think is a further conversation, just because you have such as not even you have
He
a
was heavily
man
involved
who's
with his
heavily
first 8
convicted,
films.
and between the Miramax era and his early post Miramax stuff, Harvey
He helped
Weinstein was a
finance.
dwelling presence, and we
Yeah,
have one of the top biggest filmmakers in the world. And I'm not talking gross. I'm talking name value. If we're gonna name 5 directors who can sell something off of their name, Tarantino's up there. And the
for sure.
unfortunate thing is he has the elephant in the room where he was kind of a champion show pony for a guy who was a fucking rapist,
Yeah.
sadly. And then and not only that, but he also had a level of, I mean, we were just talking about it slightly with Kill Bill, where he was pressuring not just women but people to just do things that were
People
slightly
were close to him.
unsafe, like Uma Thurman crashing her car into the tree, which is a big controversy and soured the relationship between Thurman and Tarantino. And I'm not saying, I'm not absolving Tarantino of guilt and saying it was all Weinstein, but you know, it's a
Yeah.
big elephant.
It is. It's
And you almost got to question how much Quentin Tarantino was aware and stuff. And I don't want to sour us kind of both praising the
yeah.
man,
Not
but
to
also kind of going into his work. But it's an elephant,
yeah.
man, and I think
Not to
I
not
think
to put a
that's something
damper
more
on
to talk.
things.
I agree, but
It would
I
just
think
be
that's more of a part 2 conversation. We'll get more
yeah.
into that. That might be
Yeah.
more
It's
of a
just to me.
precursor.
I feel like it would be irresponsible to not acknowledge that. Um, because I don't think dismissing something like that is as bad as committing acts like that itself, but I think dismissing it does not do anything to help, deter that from becoming even more of a problem.
Right.
So, I just, me personally, I would not feel comfortable not bringing it up because I do think it's an important thing that does need to be brought up, and I'm happy to talk about it for another 3 hours. Um, like we've done before, like so far.
Right.
But, uh, you know, um,
Well, Grant,
yeah,
do you have
yeah.
anything else to really say about Kill Bill before we start heading towards the wrap up on part 1 of this? I thought
Um,
I 100%, Grant, I'll be honest with you. I thought part 1 would be an hour and part 2 would be an hour. We're almost running to 3 hours on part 1, which is totally fine. I don't care. I don't got a time limit on this shit.
well, there's a lot to talk about with
I
him.
had fun, and I think we went deeper into the Tarantino rabbit hole than I thought we would, which I think it was an awesome episode, man. I'm pretty proud of this one. I think we did a good job.
I think I got uh, I wrote down notes for every movie that I watched. So I've talked about everything that I
So you're
um
cheating while I have to go from memory.
a little bit. Well, to be fair, this was a personal project that I was working on before any of this. Before you even approached me about being on your show. So um, it was kind of a happy little accident, I guess.
No, it works out.
But
I thought this was a great discussion, and I'd be interested to not only continue the Tarantino discussion with part 2, but also talk about other films in the future potentially, or other filmmakers in the future potentially.
this
A
was fun.
lot of who we talked about on here: Kevin Smith, Wes Anderson. I'd love not only the '90s guys, but I'm also interested in old Hollywood, new Hollywood, silent era. We'll figure shit out. Get ready
For
for
sure.
that Fritz Freelang episode, boys and girls. If you want to start taking comprehensive notes on Fritz Freelang, uh,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. But
Well,
yeah,
as you know, homework is the best way to watch and engage with art. So
it really is. I personally like. I don't know, man. I thought this was fun. So, unless you
I
have
did too.
anything else to say about Kill Bill or Quentin Tarantino that you think fits into part 1, I think that was the Grant and Connor's Power Hour Volume 9. And in 1 week from now, you know where you can expect to see Volume 10, which is where Grant and I will talk about the later half of Tarantino's career, his kind of westerns, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I think kind of one of Tarantino's cult classics, the Inglorious Bastards. So we have a lot to talk about in part 2, and I expect that to be a long as fuck episode as well, because I have a lot to say about those films, and I would assume Grant has a lot to say about those films, and I'm excited to come back. So Grant, you got anything else to say to the listening people who decided to listen to us ramble for 90? I'm sorry, not 90 minutes, 3 hours.
I mean, yeah. If anyone has made it to the end, I mean, thanks. I guess that's.
That's an achievement, man.
Yeah, because I don't know, because I feel like I don't know. We it's not like we broke any new ground with anything, but I don't know if
Grant, it's not about breaking new ground, but we did a pretty good job of consolidating old ground into one long ass video.
if someone enjoyed that and this brought a little bit of a bit of joy or some sort of peace and goodwill towards someone, then that's pretty awesome. Um, yeah.
Hell yeah, dude. All right. Well, that was the Grant and Connor's Power Hour Volume 9. You know where to find us. And we will continue with our Quentin Tarantino conversation next week. So, I don't know. Listen to that, because it'll probably be pretty interesting too.